My brother's laughter cut through me sharper than any blade. In front of our entire family, Gerard leaned close enough for everyone to hear and said, "You've never been worth a salute in your life!" The room erupted in chuckles at my expense, and I, Bernadette Lowell, sat frozen, swallowing the familiar sting of being nothing more than the family's punchline. The air at Arlington carried a silence unlike anywhere else, a silence heavy with memory, with sacrifice, with names carved into stone. Flags lined the rows in perfect symmetry, their edges snapping in the autumn breeze, while the bugle's mournful notes drifted across the gathering. Rows of Marines sat ramrod straight in their uniforms, their faces carved with discipline, their eyes forward. Around them, families filled the seats, clutching programs and photographs, whispers broken only by the solemn rituals of the day. I sat among my own, though it felt nothing like belonging. The weight of ceremony had barely settled when Gerard, glass of wine in hand, leaned back in his chair and let his voice rise just enough to slice through the reverent hush. "Tell me," he smirked, "what exactly would this country remember her for?" His words rang with deliberate cruelty, a challenge meant not just for me, but for every ear within reach. A ripple of laughter followed, sharp and mean, like gravel underfoot. A cousin chuckled into her napkin. An uncle shook his head with exaggerated pity. Even my mother said nothing, her eyes cast down, her silence cutting deeper than his mockery. I kept my hands still in my lap, though inside, a storm swelled. My thumb pressed hard against the corner of the worn military ID tucked inside my wallet, hidden from their sight. The edges had grown soft over the years, a relic I carried close, a truth I had never needed to defend. Across the rows, a few Marines shifted. Their eyes flickered briefly in my direction, measured, respectful, too subtle for the others to notice. That quiet acknowledgement lingered, wordless but undeniable, a reminder that the truth cannot stay buried forever. At the side tables where the chatter grew looser after the opening ceremony, my family gathered as if it were just another holiday dinner. Gerard held court with his usual arrogance, boasting about a new contract he had just landed. His voice carried, rich with self-importance, each word polished for the benefit of the businessmen and distant relatives eager to bask in his glow. He leaned back, a smug grin fixed on his face. "I've worked hard to make the Lowell name mean something," he said, as if the rest of us had done nothing. Then, without even glancing at me, he added, "Some of us choose to actually live, not hide away. Some of us give our families something to be proud of." A few heads nodded. Someone muttered that I had always been too quiet, too shut in, no career to speak of. The words weren't new, but coming now, carried by laughter and half-whispered judgments. They sliced deeper than before. I lowered my gaze. The sting familiar, yet freshly cruel. My silence seemed to feed their certainty, each remark laying another stone on the weight I had carried for years. Then, as the noise around me swelled, a young Marine in uniform passed behind my chair. His steps slowed just enough for his eyes to meet mine, and he gave a subtle nod, crisp and deliberate. It lasted only a second, but it landed with the force of a secret no one else had noticed. My family, absorbed in their self-congratulations, didn't catch it, but I did. And for the first time that evening, I felt a quiet reminder. The story they told about me wasn't the only one being written. The grand table in the center glittered under the chandeliers, a showcase meant for Gerard's pride. He raised his glass once more, his smirk sharper than the edge of cut crystal. "At least tonight," he quipped loudly. "She managed to arrive on time." Laughter spilled across the table, brittle and hollow, as though rehearsed. I kept my expression still, my hands folded neatly. The ridicule rolled over me like an old storm I'd weathered too many times before. But beside me, a Marine officer in his 40s gripped his water glass so tightly his knuckles whitened. He said nothing, yet his silence held an edge, a restrained reaction he couldn't quite conceal. From across the table, two younger Marines exchanged glances. They leaned toward each other, whispering just low enough to escape the family's notice. But not mine. Their eyes cut in my direction, curiosity mixed with something far stronger, recognition. No one else seemed to care. The laughter continued, Gerard soaking in the attention, basking in a spotlight he thought was his alone. Yet beneath the polished surface of his celebration, there was a current shifting in the room, one that my family was too blind to see. And I knew, with a steady calm, that it was only a matter of time before that current broke the surface. The banquet carried a veneer of solemnity, but beneath it, Gerard thrived on the sound of his own voice. He rose from his chair, adjusted his jacket, and with a theatrical flourish, set his hand on my shoulder. His smile was wide, his tone sharpened for maximum sting. "All my life," he announced, loud enough to hush the clinking of silverware. "I've understood what sacrifice means. Everyone here knows it. But her? She's never done a single thing useful for this country. She wouldn't even know the meaning of sacrifice." The words cracked through the hall, sharp as a whip. My cousins chuckled. One uncle scoffed outright, and others shook their heads as though confirming an old truth. The laughter wasn't boisterous, but cruel, meant to cut. I did not flinch, my eyes locked on Gerard's, unyielding, refusing to bow to his performance. Then, without warning, the Marine officer beside me pushed back his chair. He rose to his feet, his presence towering and silent. His gaze cut across the table, landing squarely on Gerard, with an edge so cold it silenced the chuckles. For a heartbeat, it felt as if he might speak, but he didn't. He simply held that stare, heavy with something Gerard couldn't name, then sat down again. The moment passed quickly for most, but it lingered, unsettling, as though the officer carried a truth just waiting for the right time to surface. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, prepared to transition the night back to order with the roll call of honor. Chairs shifted, glasses set down, conversations dimmed, and then, before a word could be spoken, a thunderous scrape filled the hall, rows of chairs pushed back all at once. 200 Marines, seated in formation throughout the room, rose to their feet. The synchronized strike of boots against the polished floor echoed like cannon fire. In one motion, they turned, their eyes locked on me, and in a single voice they saluted. "Ma'am Lowell!" The sound reverberated against the high ceiling, a wave of respect so powerful it froze the room. Gerard's face drained of color, his lips parted without sound. My mother clutched the edge of the table, her eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. Among the uniforms, one young Marine's eyes shone with tears. His salute held firm, raw emotion carved into his expression, as though he carried a debt tied directly to me. Gasps rippled, then silence swallowed the hall. Across the table, Gerard's business associates exchanged troubled glances, whispering, their confidence in him dissolving with every second. I sat still, the weight of the moment pressing in, then inclined my head in the smallest nod. My eyes burned, but I held steady, my silence shielding what they had yet to know. The mystery thickened, and with it, the balance of power had already shifted. The hall hung in silence after the thunder of 200 voices, every gaze pinned to Gerard. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he bolted upright, his face blotched red with fury. "This is absurd!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Just a stunt! They're only being polite to a woman!" A ripple of discomfort spread. Guests shifted uneasily, whispers passing down the rows. The air thickened with disapproval. His words rang false in a room that had just witnessed something beyond performance. From the front row, a figure rose, a Marine general, his presence commanding even before he spoke. Step by step, he crossed the hall, the weight of his silence pressing on every ear. Then his voice boomed, steady and unshakable. "We don't show politeness. We show respect. We called her Raven." The name dropped like a stone in water, sending waves across the crowd. He stopped before me, extended his hand, and when I rose, he bowed his head ever so slightly. The gesture was small, but the room seemed to tremble with it, a symbol of reverence far beyond ceremony. Boots struck the floor in unison, Marines pounding their heels in rhythmic salute, the echo rolling through the hall. Gerard's bravado faltered. His color drained as the sound boxed him in. His denial had already begun to crumble. The general took the microphone from the master of ceremonies, turning to face the packed hall. His words carried the weight of testimony, not flattery. Bernadette Lowell trained Marines in specialized strategy, he declared. She saved hundreds of lives. She refused every spotlight, every interview, because her loyalty was to her brothers in arms, not to her own name. The impact rippled instantly. My relatives, who had laughed so easily minutes before, sat frozen. My mother's head bowed low, her hands clenched together on her lap. Across the hall, several distinguished guests, politicians and military leaders alike, nodded with solemn respect. Liar! Gerard's voice broke the stillness, raw with panic. Fabricated stories! All of it! His outburst only amplified the disgrace already choking him. At the far end of the table, one of his key business partners pulled out a phone, muttering as he tapped the screen. Within seconds, the man pushed his chair back and left, leaving Gerard's face twisted in panic. Others exchanged wary looks, their interest in him dissolving before my eyes. The truth had broken free of family walls, spilling into the wider world. Gerard's smirk, his swagger, his carefully polished reputation, one by one, they withered under the weight of what could no longer be denied. The hall still pulsed with the echo of the general's words, his testimony hanging like a banner none could ignore. Gerard's chair screeched against the floor as he lunged upright, his voice splintering through the stunned quiet. "This is all just politics," he shouted, veins standing out at his neck. "She fooled you all, every last one of you." His fury cracked the fragile silence, but instead of sympathy, it drew a storm of whispers, low and contemptuous. Faces turned away from him, brows furrowed, lips pressed tight. The ripple of disapproval grew louder, spilling from table to table until it swelled into a collective murmur of disgust. At the far end of the room, several of his business associates exchanged looks, their smiles evaporating. One man, pale and stiff, pushed back his chair and walked out without a word. Another followed soon after. A third leaned toward the others, muttering, "He's finished." Before leaving Gerard standing there with no one willing to shield him, I sat still, every nerve tuned to the weight of the moment. From across the aisle, a silver-haired senator leaned closer, his voice a gravelly whisper only I could hear. "We owe you more than we ever knew." The quiet sincerity in his tone struck harder than Gerard's tantrum ever could. Desperate to reclaim the floor, Gerard spat another insult, his words tumbling out hot and bitter. But before he could finish, the general's gaze snapped toward him, sharp, unyielding, a stare that froze Gerard mid-breath. The silence that followed was damning, louder than any accusation. By then, the unraveling was complete. The man who had strutted so confidently at the start of the night stood isolated, his influence crumbling piece by piece, until nothing remained but his own shame. In that moment, Gerard's reign of arrogance ended, not with a bang, but with the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. The room had settled into a silence so complete it felt alive, pressing down on every breath. The general stood tall at the front, the microphone steady in his hand. His eyes swept across the hall, pausing long enough on Gerard to strip him of whatever bravado he still clung to, before turning back to the assembly. His voice, deep and resonant, carried with the gravity of a verdict. "No one here owes Gerard Lowell anything," he declared, each word crisp, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. "But all of us owe Bernadette Lowell respect." The effect was instantaneous. Chairs scraped back as Marines throughout the hall surged to their feet once more. The thunder of their boots striking the floor rattled the crystal glasses. rolled through the cavernous space like a drumbeat of judgment. Then, in unison, their salute snapped high. "Ma'am Lowell!" The shout roared louder than before, layered with pride, with conviction, a sound that lifted the air and left no space for denial. I did not move. I sat in the center of it all, my pulse steady, my hands folded lightly in my lap. Around me, the echo of their voices wrapped the hall in reverence I had never asked for, but could not refuse. My family, who had spent the evening turning me into the butt of their jokes, sat frozen. No laughter, no smug remarks, no cutting whispers, only silence. My mother pressed both hands over her face, her shoulders trembling, not with sobs, but with the weight of shame too long ignored. Gerard, once the loudest voice in the room, kept his gaze pinned to the tablecloth, his chest heaving as if each breath burned. I turned my head just enough to see the cousins who had smirked earlier, the uncle who had shaken his head with mock pity. Their eyes now flickered with something entirely different: guilt, unease, even fear. The arrogance that had fueled their mockery dissolved, replaced by the bitter recognition that they had stood on the wrong side. The general stepped closer, his voice lowering but still carrying through every corner of the hall. Respect is not granted by family pride, nor purchased by wealth. It is earned in silence, in sacrifice, in deeds that protect lives when no one is watching. Bernadette Lowell has given more to this country than any of you can measure. Gasps rippled through the guests, not because of theatrics, but because the truth had settled where denial could no longer reach. Even the politicians, their faces trained to reveal nothing, inclined their heads. For once, the room that had reveled in Gerard's posturing saw him for what he was, an empty echo next to a truth that dwarfed him. The Marines held their salute, unflinching, their eyes locked forward. The sound of their boots striking the floor again as they reset their stance reverberated like the closing of a judgment's gavel. It was not ceremony, it was declaration. I met their salute with a slow nod, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. I had never needed their validation, but in that moment, it mattered for the lesson it carried. Not for me, but for those who had sneered, who had believed Gerard's version of me. They could not unsee what had unfolded before them. My mother finally dropped her hands, her eyes red, darting toward me, but unable to hold my gaze. Gerard remained hunched, smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had shifted and left him exposed. No words came to his lips, none could. The moment stretched, not loud, not dramatic, but definitive. The lies had shattered, the masks had fallen. The truth was no longer hidden in whispers or glances. It stood undeniable, fortified by the voices of 200 Marines and the authority of a general who had nothing to gain. I had not argued, I had not shouted, I had not pleaded for recognition, and yet everything was laid bare before them. When the general lowered the microphone, the hall remained still, as though everyone understood they had witnessed something irreversible. Justice did not arrive in a blaze of vengeance. It arrived in the quiet force of truth, undeniable, unshakable, and final. I breathed in, slowly, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in a very long time, it was not heavy, it was liberating. The evening air at Arlington carried the crisp bite of autumn, cool against my skin as I stepped beyond the hall. The flags lining the path swayed in unison, their colors catching the last light of day. From somewhere distant, the bugle rose again, its solemn notes stretching across the grounds, fading with each step I took away from the gathering. The sound had accompanied countless farewells. Tonight, it felt like closure of a different kind. Behind me, the doors creaked open, and the shuffle of hesitant footsteps followed. A few relatives moved as if to approach, their faces softened now with something that might have been regret. Their lips parted, but no words came. I met their uncertainty with a single look and a faint smile, the kind that neither invited nor rejected, just ended the conversation before it began. They stopped where they stood, As I continued down the stone path, a small figure darted into view. My niece, no older than 12. She didn't speak, didn't move closer, but her eyes found mine. There was no disdain in them, no judgment, only a bright, unwavering admiration. In that gaze, I saw what the others never offered, the promise that the next generation might understand what the last could not. I paused, only long enough to hold her look, then turned forward again. My thoughts settled into a quiet certainty. There are victories that never need to be told, but when the truth finally speaks, it silences arrogance forever. The gravel crunched softly under my shoes as I left the hall behind. No apology could erase what had been said, and I didn't need one. No recognition could add to what I already knew. My worth had never lived in their approval. It had been mine all along, and with each step into the cool night, I carried it with me, calm, untouchable, complete.